Good morning, everyone. Our session speaker is Dr. Ken Fry, and he'll be updating us about the Dutch elm disease threat to Alberta trees. Dr. Ken Fry, coordinator for the Horticulture program and entomology instructor in the School of Life Science and Business at Olds College, has been involved in insect pest management research, teaching, and extension for 25 years, including 9 years as a research scientist at the Alberta Research Council. His research is focused on biological control of insect pests and integrated pest management. So let's all give a warm welcome to Dr. Ken Fry.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me well enough. Yes, good. My voice is a bit raspy. I was talking twice at a conference yesterday, and so now here I am today. Back home. That's why I like it, is the Green Industry Show. They asked me specifically to speak about Dutch elm disease. Many of you might have heard that there was a recent identification of Dutch elm disease in Edmonton in 2024, and I'll give a bit of a background on Dutch elm disease in general. And so what I'm going to talk about is the disease itself, the vector beetles that transmit the disease, its prevalence in Canada over the past few decades. And then I'm going to sort of tuck into what's the situation in Saskatchewan, how that relates to Alberta, and then the specific Alberta consequences or circumstances. And I'd like to thank, first of all, Society to Prevent Dutch Elm Disease for their support in preparing this presentation with the information they provided. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency, we had a recent contact of what we call a technical advisory committee of sorts, and most recently in September, going through the results of the activities in Edmonton this fall. And then the people at the City of Edmonton, Mike Jenkins, Sarah McPike, and others, for their excellent work, and particularly Sarah should be given kudos for the one who detected that first declining tree that sparked this. So lover or hater, it's those keen eyes that are responsible for our detection at this point in time. And that's a shout out to all of you who work in urban forests, and how important it is for you to be ever vigilant and spotting those declining trees, and then taking action to either inspect them more closely, have them inspected, have samples taken and samples submitted to the provincial laboratory so that we can clearly delineate where an infection has taken place. And as I'll go through the CFIA, I had a conversation with Andrea Saunders just the other day to get the final update from CFIA. There's a lot that arose out of our most recent advisory meeting as to process, protocol, that sort of thing. So I'll give you a bit of an update on the status of the regulatory status that CFIA has adopted in the Edmonton situation. So with that, elm trees. Okay, full disclosure, as you all know, I'm an entomologist, not a plant person. So if I make any botanical errors, please excuse me. I will defer to your expertise. But as I understand it, there are a number of different elm species in North America, some of them native, some of them introduced. If we talk about rock or red elm, those are more eastern species in Ontario and Quebec. Siberian elm is an introduced species, and it hails from Asia, whereas the American elm is a native species, but it's native to eastern North America. And but we have seen extensive plantings in Western North America, and particularly Western Canada, along with the Prairie Rehabilitation, PFRA, Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, now defunct, but they were aggressively pushing elm trees as shelter belt plantings the previous few decades. And then similarly as an urban or street tree, it's an exquisite example of a tree that provides a beautiful canopy, as we all know. It provides excellent sight lines around corners, so it's a good boulevard tree. And it's good for security because the canopy is elevated, and so you have good sight lines, and so public security is assured that way too, if it's in a park setting, etc. So it's a beautiful tree that we have. We rely on it extensively, as I'll get into in just a moment. So what's the inventory? As you can see, I've put the native range of elm, American elm, up, and it's predominantly eastern and southern, at least in Canada. But we've seen extensive plantings throughout the West. I can't stress enough for urban foresters the value and utility, as this will become even more readily apparent, of tree inventories. incredibly important to delineate where each and every individual tree is. And now we're getting a lot of automated systems where you can just drive down the street with cameras. They do tree recognition, and then you can do identification down to the point of individual tree notifications, and you can track the health status, treatment status, etc. These tree inventories, although laborious initially, are incredibly useful when tracking infestations, for managing your urban forest, allocating resources and labor, work, that sort of thing. I have to credit the Stop Dead organization for doing tree inventories in rural areas, and so all our collaborators in all the counties and municipalities, super, absolutely. I mean, it takes a village, right? So roughly, I mean, these numbers are a little bit out of date simply because, it's ever changing. There's tree losses and there's tree plantings, but roughly it's around 330K elms in Alberta. The preponderance of them are in urban centers, obviously, is a major street tree, but there are quite a few out in the rural areas. And this will become important when we talk about the biology and dispersal behavior of these beetles and potentially the disease that comes with it. It's a very expensive inventory. It's valued at over $1 billion if we wanted to replace these trees. So it's very valuable. Unfortunately, there's a disproportionate number of these elm trees in our urban plantings. So in other words, we don't have a lot of biodiversity. Makes sense. It's a prairie. Prairies have short things. We call them grasses. Big, tall sticks, those are weeds to turf people. So I don't want to get into internecine wars here about turfies and horts and whatnot and foresters and arborists, but strictly speaking, it's unexpected to have so many trees in a prairie grassland ecosystem. So right there and there, I should tell you that they're probably somewhat out of place and likely under a certain level of stress that they're not accustomed to. Second of all, as we know about tree biology and forest biology, in particular ecology, a tree that is standalone is not in its native habitat. It's not in its habitat that it's evolved in. So it might not have the mycorrhizal fungi or microflora community in the soil that it's normally associated with. So right there, its ability to acquire resources like nutrients and water to defend itself from other organisms is somewhat compromised. It doesn't have the protection of a forested setting, that sort of thing. So these trees that are standalone are under an increased amount of stress, and therein lies the vulnerability of these trees to succumb more readily to disease and pest infestations more so than normally. So, and then when we look at the other major component of our urban forest being ash trees, green ash in particular. Thank you, cottony psyllid, for wiping out the Manchurian and the black ash. But strictly speaking, if you have two major species that are roughly 50 to 60% of your urban forest canopy, and either of those are vulnerable to a devastating disease or an insect infestation, that leaves our urban forests incredibly vulnerable. So the role of the urban forester, of the arborist is I think, increasingly important nowadays, not just at the operational level of caring for the trees, but in terms of the management and strategic level thinking about urban planning and biodiversity and planning in terms of what trees we put out there, what kinds of plants we put out there, and what kind of ecosystem that we put them out into. So yeah, absolutely. There's never too much advocacy that you can have on the on forests and trees and tree health. So every chance you get, advocate strongly for more ecologically based tree plantings in your urban forests. It'll make your lives easier because you won't have as much stressed trees, and it will make life easier for everyone involved, including all the birds and other insects and all the other plants, and preservation of our asphalt surfaces and heating and cooling costs. And so many more studies have come out now about the mental health and even physiological benefits that a green space has in terms of productivity if you're very mercenary. So good workers, if they can see a tree, they're more productive. But just in terms of general sensitivity or sensibility of a human, if they can see some greenness in their everyday life. So we know how important that is, and you cannot advocate strongly enough, often enough to reinforce that. Okay, here's the thing that we're working with. It's Dutch elm disease. Don't hate on the Dutch. It's just that they were the ones that were doing a lot of the research to investigate this particular disease. All right. It's like the Spanish flu. Didn't come from Spain. It just happened to be that they were neutral during the First World War and they weren't involved in anything. And so they could allocate resources to investigate that plague. So don't hate on the Dutch. So Ophiostoma almi is the principal organism out of East Asia. And there have been some other various strains, in particular, novel almi. It is a strain that is now rampant across North America. It's more pathogenic than almi itself. There's actually two substrains. There's novel almi americana, which is now resident in North America, and there's another subspecies in Europe. So the spores are introduced at feeding sites. Now, with two of the vectors I'll talk about in more detail in just a moment. It's introduced through crotch feeding. So at the crotch of a branch, they'll start feeding at that little indentation, and the spores are introduced that way. The native elm bark beetle takes a different tact and actually takes it right in through the bark, introduces it that way. This disease compromises the vascular tissues, and it can also be transferred through root grafts, which will become somewhat pertinent when we talk about, spacing of plants and the response of detection of the disease and how many trees in the vicinity need to be removed. It's saprophytic in the xylem, can be very pathogenic when it gets into the bark. Let's see. If you have close planting of trees within about 7 meters or 20 feet, there's a very high probability that a neighboring tree can contract the disease through the root graft. So when we're thinking about ornamental plantings along a boulevard, the spacing of trees is very important. We want to go beyond that 7-meter spacing. It may not fit into our urban design plan. Well, then we need to rethink our urban design plans. So we want to have these trees isolated to a certain extent. That may not be nice for the trees because the trees might like to root graft and say, hey, we're a community now. We're like a super organism and we can better thrive that way. We can better communicate that way. But ideally, it also leads to that higher risk of disease transmission. Okay, in North America. So it was detected in the 1930s in Ohio, likely brought in the 1920s from Europe in logs or other materials that hadn't been constructed out yet. Novo almi was recognized in the 1940s and into Western Canada a little bit later on. All elm are hosts, but Asian species seem to have a higher degree of resistance. And it stands to reason because these organisms, the trees and the microbe, co-evolved together in East Asia. And so the trees have grown a resistance to it. Doesn't mean that they're completely independent of the disease. They can succumb to it, but they have a much greater resistance to that disease. So it has to have a really high infection rate for it to overwhelm the plant's defenses. So we've seen it move across from Quebec to out into the Maritimes and then into Manitoba, the native stands of elm there, into Saskatchewan. The first documented detection was 1981. And then in Alberta, we've had three separate detections. And I'll get into those a little bit later. But it's clear that it's making it's an inexorable march across the prairies, regrettably. So, who's who? There are 3 species, one of which is native, the native elm bark beetle, Hierogopinus rufipes. Knock on wood, it hasn't been detected here in the prairies, or at least in Alberta as yet. It's typically associated with the Native American elm in its native range in eastern North America. It is, for someone who works in the field of detection, it's going to be challenging if we have to find the native elm bark beetle, only because it looks like a lot of other bark beetles. I'm just going to step out here, and what we can see is with scolatines, scolitis, these are the 2 introduced species. This is called the elytra, or the hardened wing covers of the first pair of wings. They're hardened. The underneath flight wings are tucked in underneath. And what we can see is that this goes straight across. So this, what we call a declivity, the area where the elytra would normally come down and cover its bum, these are shameless. They just show the bum off like crazy, right? It's like a cat with its tail up. Don't need to see bum, but there we do. We see it fully exposed. And so Hylogaupinus, though, has a fully formed declivity like most other bark beetles. So then when you're looking at the elm bark beetle traps, this is a very easy animal to spot. Once you've got your eye trained for it, it's very easy to spot. So you can take those large sticky traps and just scan them and go, oh, bang, 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 bang. Easy detection. The other one, that means we'd have to pull it off, clean it, and then try to discern whether it's one of 100 other species. So in terms of detection, if the native elm bark beetle gets out here, it sort of adds another level of complexity to detection. But for the smaller European elm bark beetle and the banded elm bark beetle, I know it's somewhat obscure here, but there is a ventral spine on both of these. In the banded elm bark beetle, it's quadrate, rhomboid. It's not circular or cylindrical. So it's an irregular shape, stumpy, very easy to determine and discern versus the smaller European elm bark beetle. Smaller European elm bark beetle, it protrudes quite easily and quite far out, very cylindrical, easy to see. And to distinguish it on these traps from another bark beetle species that affects spruce, Scoletus picea, this little cylindrical spine is not ventral, it's medial. So where's the spine on the butt? Is it at the bottom or in the middle? You can easily tell them apart. So there you go. You know everything need to know about beetle butts, and you can identify them. All right. So the smaller European elm bark beetle was found on the Harvard University campus. It's in 1909. It's native to Western Europe, hence the smaller European elm bark beetle. I don't know if there's a larger European elm bark beetle, but there's a smaller one certainly. But there's the European elm bark beetle, another Scoletus species over in Europe. It's a vector of the disease. This species happened to have made it to North America and survives somewhat. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Its preferred hosts tend to be American elm and to a much lesser extent Siberian elm and Chinese elm. The banded elm bark beetle much prefers the Siberian elm. Now, as I'll tell you a little bit later in this presentation, there were banded elm bark beetles isolated from the American elms that were infected in Edmonton. It's a highly unusual situation. A lot of work done out of the University of Manitoba by Neil Holliday. What he found was by putting out bait bolts of elm versus Siberian versus American, he found that the only time that he was able to detect banded elm bark beetle attacking American elm is when those elms were previously attacked by the smaller European elm bark beetle. And his hypothesis is that whereas the smaller European elm bark beetle, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the monitoring section, it uses an aggregation pheromone and a sex pheromone, so they talk to each other chemically, and they communicate so that they can have an aggregation overwhelm a tree, because a tree, as you well know, has a good defense mechanisms, both constitutive and inducible. And one little bark beetle can be compartmentalized, and it can be taken care of or tolerated by a tree, but you get enough beetles in there, it overwhelms that defensive mechanism. And so the small European elm bark beetle sort of relies on that gang attitude that, okay, if we have enough animals here, some of us are going to die, but overall the group is going to survive and the tree will succumb. The banded elm bark beetle does not, particularly as far as we know, rely on pheromones for that aggregation. They're more of if it smells like a tree, sounds good to me. And so they're very much more susceptible or responsive to host odor lures. So when a tree is harmed, in particular ethanol is given off, don't be hitting trees to get a drink, okay? Just saying. But they do give off ethanol as a response to injury and damage. And it's shown that the smaller European elm bark beetle isn't nearly as attuned to that tree damage, but instead its own communication system. But the banded elm bark beetle, if that American elm has been harmed by the smaller European, then that signal that tree is giving off that I'm hurting, that signal, that host odor, is what then subsequently attracts the banded elm bark beetle. So we typically don't consider the banded elm bark beetle as a major vector threat, unless there's a pre-existing population of smaller European elm bark beetles. But this most recent infection in Edmonton is a bit troubling in that it's predominantly banded elm bark beetle, or exclusively banded elm bark beetles that were extracted from those trees. So that's something that needs to be looked at in much greater detail. So how does it work? Basically, the beetles, I'm going to talk about smaller European and banded, which has a very different life cycle than the native elm bark beetle, but we'll ignore that for the time being. But the two European ones, they overwinter as a pre-pupa. So it's gone through its larval stage, it's been feeding through the season, and then it sort of reaches this stage where it's not quite pupated yet, but it's in a resting stage, a non-feeding stage, and it's meant to be the environmentally resistant stage so that it can overwinter successfully under the bark. And then in the spring, it pupates and the adults emerge. You get some maturation feeding on the plant itself, and that's where that crotch feeding is going, some shoot tips, things like that. That's wherein they can transmit the fungi, if they have it infected. And then the eggs are laid as they tunnel in, lay the eggs, and then the larvae are feeding throughout the rest of the season. So the thing about doesn't overwinter well in northern areas, especially this smaller European elm bark beetle. And this is why we don't see it very prevalent in sort of the Edmonton region. We've seen it in the southern parts of the province, but over the last 12 years that I've been working with Stop Dead and their monitoring, and we identify these Alta species, every beetle that we find on every trap, we've seen that there's been I won't say a displacement, but certainly a dominance of banded elm bark beetle moving up from the south, where it originally started to occur in Alberta, around the Medicine Hat area, and it's moving up, and we're seeing it now further north in the province. And then we've had a concurrent reduction in the numbers of smaller European elm bark beetles that we're detecting, to the point where in some communities where that was the only species present, now it's completely absent, and all we see is banded elm bark beetle. Is it competitive exclusion? Probably not, because they're typically not living in the same trees. The banded elm bark beetle really thrives on the Siberian elm, whereas a smaller European elm bark beetle prefers the American elm. So it's not like it's the banded elm bark beetles are booting them out of the American elms. It's likely more of a climate effect. You're saying, but Ken, climate's warming, so shouldn't they be able to overwinter better? But it depends on the severity of those cold snaps. In that pre-pupal stage, they're quite vulnerable to really cold temperatures. The reason the native elm bark beetle has been able to succeed so well in North America is its different biology, is the adults will emerge in the fall and go down into the much thicker bark at the base of the trees, burrow in there, and they have a much higher insulation capacity there, that they don't suffer the freezing temperatures or the extreme temperatures that the more surface inhabiting pre-pupae of the smaller European elm bark beetle does. So that biology of that native elm bark beetle is really attuned it to where it lives naturally, eastern North America. I mean, right, if anything can live in Winnipeg, right? But it has to do with the trees there, those native stands, much larger trees, much thicker bark. So it's adapted to those specific conditions. Can it fare as well out here in the West with the smaller diameter trees, right? Not as thick an insulating layer. So that remains to be seen. And that may be why, once again, knock on wood, that we haven't seen an abundance of native elm bark beetle out west. But the very fact that we do have these cold snaps, and that the biology of the European beetles is that they're more sort of surface hibernating, that they're more vulnerable to those cold snaps. Apparently the banded elm bark beetle seems to be a little bit more cold tolerant. So we'll see what happens in terms of the severity of the risk of the disease transmission. What else do I want to say about that? The banded elm bark beetle does, as far as we know, from its historical ranges to studies in the United States and to a little bit of its distribution here in Alberta, it prefers areas with annual accumulations of precipitation of less than 400 millimeters. So that's typically around southern Alberta, but we are seeing it now increasingly in the middle and northern regions of Alberta. So that precipitation, preferring arid environments, may not be holding true to the populations that are developing within the prairies. All right. So Both of these are known as competent vectors. And what that means is they've done experiments to inoculate the beetles with the fungus and then expose those beetles to trees and then that are uninfected with the disease, and then finding that the disease is transmitted to that tree, but further that then uninfected beetles can be isolated or incubated with those trees, pick up the fungus, and then inoculate other trees. So there is this vector capability and competence. The smaller European elm bark beetle is a much more competent vector. In other words, it passes on a higher proportion of spores or number of spores and has a higher probability of infecting a tree that is uninfected. So the banded elm bark beetle, like we say, is unlikely to infect American elm, but we're seeing some disturbing example in Edmonton of it having been able to infect elm. Ideally, it's not usually considered to be a major risk. One other thing I should say about the banded elm bark beetle, in its native range, it will actually feed on a wide range of plants in the Rosaceae. And so it has a much broader host range than just elm. But what we haven't seen is the banded elm bark beetle in the prairies and in western North America. It hasn't been infecting these other Rosaceae species. Instead, it's limited itself pretty much to the elms. So we were worried that with this broad host range, it could be, incubating, as it were, on other hosts. And when it was opportunistic, it would invade. We'd have this, resident population that could all of a sudden then transfer to elm. That doesn't seem to be the case. And the fact that it is not, the banded elm bark beetle is not as competent a vector, we weren't as concerned about the banded elm bark beetle numbers increasing both in numbers in localities as well as its range in Alberta, becoming further north. Well, stay tuned. Okay, monitoring. What do we do? Typically, as you know, and many of you are good collaborators, and we thank you very much for sending in the traps. We do appreciate your hard work. We use the trap on your left, and those are the big sticky traps. You can see the pheromone bait. We use what's called a multi-lure, and that's a pheromone bait for the smaller European elm bark beetle. But we also use a host volatile lure. So sometimes you used to have two little containers. Now we have the same unified pouch that has both lures within it. It's very effective and been proven effective over time for the smaller European elm bark beetle. But we suspect that it is undersampling the banded elm bark beetle because the host odor lure is not a major component. So if that's what the banded elm bark beetle is responding to, we're likely not getting as many attracted to the trap as we are the smaller European elm bark beetle. So it's an underestimate. So when Medicine Hat had those large outbreaks where we're getting 3,000, 4,000 beetles per trap, you can imagine that it could be another factor, it could be double, it could be, 10 times more that we're actually out there. So that's something we might want to think about in terms of our trapping and what lures we're using. If the banded elm bark beetle is now becoming the predominant animal that's out there, we might have to change our lure strategy. There is a lot of work that shows that the Lindgren funnel trap to your right, it's Stefan Lindgren from Simon Fraser. He invented this trap. It's very good for bark beetles, not so much for longhorn beetles because of the small trapping area, but it's also a very useful trap. Let's see what else. That's about it. Okay. Something else we have to think about is when we're trapping, we're hoping to lure the animal to a facsimile of a tree. That's what the vertical darkness of a Lindgren funnel trap is, or through the odors that come to the sticky trap. And it's okay at sort of mid-level population densities, but if you have a really low density, so very few beetles around, you're competing with the actual trees. And are they going to go to a sticky card or are they going to go to an actual tree? And more often than not, they're going to go to the tree. So trapping at low densities, if you're trying to detect an infestation at its lowest level, very difficult with trapping. And similarly with high densities, the trap gets overwhelmed and it's not very sensitive. Do we have 1,000 beetles per kilometer or do we have 10,000 beetles per kilometer? We just know we've got a lot of beetles per kilometer. But in that small sort of intermediate range, trapping is good. And what the utility of that trapping is then it tells us, are there, a whole bunch Let's take action. Let's, examine our trees and determine what their health status is, and maybe we have to intervene, significantly. Or is it very low? It's almost undetectable. Okay, they're there. We can't say that they're not there. So if you have a blank trap, so a negative on a given locality, on a given trapping season, doesn't mean they're not there. It just means that the population could potentially just be low or below the threshold of the efficacy of that trap. So that's something to think about. Saskatchewan and Manitoba, they do some trapping, but for the most part, they've transitioned to tree inspections. And so that's where you come in. So many eyes out there. If you're driving along, if you're servicing your customers, etc., and you notice a tree that is hurting, or shows symptoms like it's wilting, discoloration, that sort of thing, that's a much better detection. It's an early detection, and then you do your sampling and testing if necessary. So the monitoring with traps is useful, but it has its limitations. The problem with visual surveys, Stop Dead well knows, because they've contracted out in very specific highlighted areas where we've done detection with monitoring that says there's something going on here. Then we do the visual survey. They're labor intensive and they're costly. But if we value our urban forests as much as we should, then that is a cost we should be worth bearing. Okay, Saskatchewan. This is their most recent report, and I want to thank Saskatchewan for their very detailed reporting that they do in terms of distributions. In Regina in 2024, this is up significantly from 24 trees, so 85 trees in 2024. They attribute this probably to a heavy drought stress in the last 2 seasons, and that those trees are hurting, and so they're much more vulnerable, and that means the beetles have more success, more reproductive success, hence the numbers are up. Saskatoon, once again, the numbers are up as well. Not to the degree that they are in Regina, but they are up. One thing I want to point out, and the color's showing up nicely, so thank you, tech people, for, don't want to get too close to that. So basically, this is what they consider to be the range of the disease. So for you over there, it's that red hatched mark. That's the range of the disease in a sort of global projection. Doesn't mean that it's resident in every county within that red area. This is sort of the native range, that upper quadrant. So I'll show you up here. So that upper quadrant there is a lot of native stands of elm, and it's considered to be endemic to that region. But I don't know if it's going to be clear enough to you. You can see some little orange veins standing out. And this is what's very interesting, and anybody wants to do a master's degree, here's a great project for you. Essentially, these are riparian areas. So these riverine areas, that's where the native elm bark beetle typically goes, and that's where elm typically lives, is in these wetter zones. And the beetle moves along these riparian areas, so these river systems. There's some evidence showing that from studies out, once again, out in Manitoba, that it's not just the river systems that are serving as highways and conduits for both the beetle and the disease, but shelter belts. You imagine this grid work of shelter belts all across the prairies with elm trees along them. So that long row of elms is just like a riparian area, and the beetles will traverse those areas. And so if you're thinking, well, how's it going to get across from Saskatchewan to Alberta? I mean, they got these vast tracts of land that they would have to cross. That's dry grassland. But if you have a shelter belt, it acts like a riparian zone, and there's your highway built right in. So if we're going to do some intensive monitoring in terms of potential areas of invasion from Saskatchewan, so we're almost there, right? We're almost there. And there's some significant risk of natural dispersion of the infected beetles and of the disease. Is we need to pay attention to where those major shelter belts are and where those riparian areas are. And so if you look through, think of it as a mountain pass. Where is it going to come through across the Great Divide? You're going to look at those mountain passes. We need to look at riparian areas and shelter belt lines. And that's as a natural distribution mechanism. Then come humans, the most unnatural of all, in regards to transport of firewood. So, yes, I will go on record. If you see someone transporting elm firewood from one locality to another, beat them with it, okay? So it is bad. It is simply bad. burn it where you buy it, okay? So that's the single largest risk factor for us is that recreational transportation of firewood that could house the beetles and the disease. And that's probably the single biggest risk that we face. So please be advocates about responsible firewood transport and use. No, there is no responsible transport. There is just using it locally, and that's it. Don't transport firewood. Why would you burn so much fuel transporting wood? You're not going to save money. Anyway, so what else? Okay, Alberta. This is what you've been waiting for. 1998 in Wainwright, and there was just one tree tested. It did 3 years of monitoring, so this will come in and be germane in just a moment. In 2020 in Lethbridge, 2 trees were removed. It was declared a potentially actionable event, and so what a PAC is to CFIA is, okay, here is an event that has occurred, and we're not going to regulate the vicinity just yet. We have to meet certain criteria. So it's potentially actionable. And so they have a DED advisory group. They prepared a response document to it. Their Lethbridge response was robust is too light of a word. They went at it with everything they had, and you have to congratulate that group very much. 2 years of monitoring post-detection was required to satisfy CFIA requirements. That's interesting, because this is the most recent flowchart. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff here. And I had to get express permission from Andrea to use this because it isn't published yet by the CFIA. They're awaiting the French language translation. But strictly speaking, I have her blessing to show you this. But what it is you don't have to read it all. But what it's really talking about, there's 4 options. 1, and that's where, say, Wainwright and Lethbridge we're at. And that is, it says, eradication with no change in regulatory status. And that means they've detected it, they've taken steps to eradicate the infected material, and they've done monitoring for 2 to 3 years. And after that period, it's not detected any further. It is considered safe. We do not have to regulate the area. What does regulate the area mean? It means no export of any elm products or elm trees of any size class out of that area, right? So it means if you were a tree nursery, you couldn't sell outside of that regulated area. You couldn't manufacture value-add products and move wood out of that area. So 3 years of visual surveys usually are what are required to achieve that. Option 2, eradication with change to partially regulated status as an interim measure. So in other words, the infestation is large enough to warrant some concern. Now in Lethbridge, it was only 2 trees, and they tested for a kilometer radius around, and so it was very localized. Edmonton's a bit of a different story. And so it remains to be seen. But if you get to a level 2 or option 3, and option 3 is management with change to partially regulated status. 2 and 3, 2 says we can still, we can still eradicate it. There's a good probability or high probability of success for eradication, but we're going to need you to monitor to have it successful or prove it successful. But level 3 says, yeah, you know what? You're sort of borked. It's now naturalized. We have to consider it endemic now, and we're going to regulate it. But you're still going to have to manage it. We don't want you to just say, all right, that's it. Just let the disease run rampant. You still need to manage it aggressively. But you are in a regulated status. And then, of course, red is option 4, which basically says you're hooped. You have a change to fully regulated, and that means not just the locality, the county or the municipality, but now the entire province of Alberta is now considered DED endemic and no export whatsoever of any product out of the province. So that could significantly harm nurseries. It could significantly harm our horticultural industry. So right now, as it stands, we're at a level 2. So that means eradication is the target, it is the goal, and it's a realistic goal, but there needs to be mandatory monitoring, and you have to go anywhere from 3 to 5 years now of monitoring and without a single subsequent detection to then get out of that locally regulated status. So that's something that we need to think about. An example of this being successful is the Asian longhorn beetle. Not the one that was found in Edmonton, but the population that was found in York. So they found the trees, they eradicated locally the trees that were infested, and then for a 5-kilometer radius, it was an exclusion zone where they inspected every single tree, and they monitored them for 5 years. And only after 5 years of no further detections was it declared unregulated and free of Asian longhorn beetle. Until 2 years later, another infection was found. But it was a different species. Or sorry, a different population. They sequenced the DNA of the original population and found that it was different from the second detection. So it was 2 different populations. It was 2 separate introductions of that animal. So it's that 3 to 5 year range instead of just a 2-year range. And what will trigger 2-year versus 3 to 5 year is the status of, are there exclusively susceptible trees in the area? So that would be American elm are susceptible. If it's only American elm in the area, then it's about a 2-year, maybe a 3-year monitoring period before that option is downgraded to unregulated. If unfortunately there are some disease tolerant, not resistant necessarily, but tolerant species like Siberian elm, make up a significant proportion of the trees in the area, then it's a 3 to 5 year, probably a 5-year monitoring period. And the reason being is it's thought that if you have disease tolerant trees, the disease could still be in the area. It just hasn't been transferred yet to the susceptible trees. And so there's a reservoir of disease in the area that is not detectable unless you actually went out and actively sampled every one of those disease-tolerant species, Siberian elms in our case. So then you have to have, this is where the tree inventory comes in. Do you know exactly which trees are out there? Where are they located specifically through GPS coordinates? And what species are they? So can you immediately from your tree inventory go, we have no disease-tolerant species within the regulated area? Then it's only a 2 to 3 year time frame for monitoring, intensive monitoring. Or if we do have those disease-tolerant trees, it's going to be a 3 to 5 year monitoring term. So that's why the inventories are so incredibly important. All right. Couple more minutes. So in Edmonton, 2024, in August, 4 trees tested positive. Banded elm bark beetle infestation was in another tree as well. In October, a 5th tree was tested positive. It was initially negative, but was retested and came back positive. Another 19 trees or 23 trees were removed. There were 13 lab samples sent to the laboratory. I haven't heard about the results yet, but we suspect there'll be more trees that come in positive. I shouldn't say expect, but there's potential for more of those neighboring trees. But every tree within a kilometer radius, so each tree that was tested positive over a kilometer radius, every single tree, every elm tree was examined and tested. Within the immediate vicinity of the positive trees were removed. Anything that looked like it was symptomatic. Now this is late in the season. And they're taking a lot of action. They're also going to reinvigorate their activities in the spring and be examining trees in that exclusionary zone or that sensitive monitoring zone as well. So might be some updates coming in the spring from the city of Edmonton. So I just once again say Sarah McPike, she was driving along and spotted a tree and was immediately suspicious of it. That tree was so far gone, they could not get a positive test from it. Simply because that tree, it was dead. So it had been infected for some time. And that's somewhat concerning. In terms of the trees, the first tree that was spotted was 55 centimeter diameter breast height. peeling bark, pretty much dead. There were 3 city-owned trees that tested positive, about 15 to 25 centimeter diameter, within 100 to 200 meters of the dead tree. One of them was on private property and has since been evaluated, and it was about 500 meters away. So, and that there was an order sent out for that individual to take that private city tree down and disposed of under CFIA oversight. So there are particular protocols, and if you're wondering what the protocols are, there's a website that Stop Dead has with the Alberta government. It tells you very specifically what you need to do to take a sample, and where to send it and how to send it. And then there's also a very specific protocol on how to remove the trees. And specifically, if you can't take the stump out right away, you're going to leave it over till, say, the next year, as you must debark the stump in its entirety. So you cannot leave any overwintering habitat for any beetles on that tree that's been taken down. So there's been a 100-kilometer protocol zone with advanced visual inspections. Edmonton remains at a Category 1. So fortunately for us, the efforts that are there, the capacity that's in place. Now, that's a big municipality. Smaller rural municipalities may not have the people power to do this. They may need to seek external supports, either from the province or otherwise. But they're staying now at a level 1, and that's sorry if I misspoke earlier. So Andrea has stated that at least for the time being, they're at a level 1 or Category 1. So they're going to be monitoring to continue for a minimum of 2 years. And Mike let us know in the phone call that he's done some drone monitoring with near infrared, and pretty fascinating stuff. From the visualization, he's noticed, now this is correlation, not causation, and it needs to be ground truth, but of the trees that they were looking at, there is a detectable difference in the canopy reflectance in the near infrared spectrum. And so that might be a really interesting tool to be able to use for early detection of stressed trees. And then that could target your visual inspections and tree sampling, because you don't want to overwhelm the lab with hundreds or thousands of samples, because just the processing time alone would be prohibitive, let alone the cost. But if we can then do it remotely through these analytical systems, we might have a pretty strong tool for us. So, process protocol. All right. Basically what we're saying here is the lab in Edmonton will not take independent private sector or homeowner submissions. You need to have that tree sample submitted through an authority, your municipality, your county, ag field persons. I say ag field person, not ag fieldman. I know they've made their peace with ag fieldman, but I say ag field person, sorry. And Stop Dead. So they're the ones that are submitting samples. So this way, there's a reason. It's a very good reason. It's called, being able to quantify the threat. If all these samples come in and then there's just this correspondence from the lab to the individual submitter, there isn't a comprehensive understanding of the disease incidence or risk or threat, or even the tree health status. Like, what if elms are declining for another reason altogether, and that would make them more vulnerable to Dutch elm disease and the vector beetles? We need to know about that health status. So having a sort of centralized collection of information will help us be very proactive in our actions. So, like I say, the sample protocol is on the Dutch elm disease submitting lab samples website, and it's very articulate. It has very distinct steps on how to do it, and what length of tree that you need to break down and send in, where it's to be taken from the tree, etc. There was a long conversation, and I can't give you a conclusion, but Alex Coker from the city of Calgary asked a very good question, disturbing question. Can you detect the disease from a tree that does not show brown staining? because typically the vascular bundle, that's one of the major symptoms that occurs is, and the signs of the disease infection is the brown staining of the vascular bundle in early stages of the disease. What if it's not there? That staining's not there. Can the disease be detected? We don't know for certain. So there's another master's project for you. So if any of you want to go into research, have at it. There's lots there. So ultimately, communication is key. Please contact the Society to Prevent Dutch Elm Disease if you have a suspect tree. Contact your local municipality. Contact the province. The CFIA will be informed. You say, oh, you're ratting us out to the feds. No, that's not the case. There are partners in this. They have resources to bring to bear. They have a federal responsibility to look at the biosecurity of our forests, urban and otherwise. So that's why this regulatory process is there. They've worked with us hand in hand the whole time, full transparency. They've been very collaborative. So that is, oh, that's surprising. No, but it's actually very gratifying that we've got a really good team between here in Saskatchewan and BC that is looking at this problem for us. But there are strict criteria because they're trying to protect the country, not just vested interests in a business, but the country as a whole. And that's profound, but it is meaningful. Okay, so please observe the pruning ban. Right? It's for a reason. It's, we don't want to have the trees expressing that stress release of host volatiles that will encourage and recruit beetles into the tree. So please observe that because that's the flight period. And Stop Dead has done some really good work with its collaborators at the City of Edmonton and elsewhere. Medicine Hat they've done very specific targeted trapping throughout the year to see when is the flight period of these beetles. Be observant, right? If you are doing pruning and you do see that stained sapwood, by all means, please be suspicious. You cannot be overreactive in this instance. So report it if you can. If you see wilt, if you see beetle emergence holes, etc. And lastly, not least, please don't transport firewood. And if in your job as a tree healthcare professional, then when you're transporting your material, you chip it, you destroy it in the way that is recommended. Once again, we don't want to have inoculum, whether it's beetles or disease, transported even within a vicinity of a municipality or especially within a county. So ensure that you destroy that material. Yes, it will add an extra cost. Weigh that against losing all those trees and therefore your customers, because really the tree's your customer, not the human, right? You're looking after the tree. Humans, so that's something to think about is the long-term picture is if we lose our urban forest, we lose, our whole capacity as a horticulture sector. So that's something to think about. So little short-term pain for long-term gain. Look after the trees. This is an evolving situation. It's not being handled in a haphazard fashion. It's a very directed fashion. There's an appropriate response being made by all parties involved. But it takes, once again, a village to ensure that it doesn't spread further beyond the boundaries. And so, yeah, absolutely. Communication is key. If you have something that's suspect, communicate it to Stop Dead, communicate it to your municipality or county. And hopefully this will be, like the two previous incidences, a spot infection that is eradicated and we can go on, but albeit in a vigilant way. So with that, that's an update on Stop Dead for now.